Thank you so much, Juan, and thank you all for coming near and far. Go back to 2009. Here in Chicago, both of our downtown daily newspapers are in bankruptcy. People are nervous that local news coverage is disappearing, and where are citizens going to get the information they need to make good decisions? The Community Trust commissioned the Community Media Workshop to take a look at this on-loose environment. For 20 years, the workshop has published an annual media guide, so we've had kind of a roadmap phone book to all that is media in the Chicagoland region, indeed around the Midwest. And of course, it noticed ourselves from the middle 90s on this beginning gradual shift from paper to online. And so we were also curious, as our job is primarily helping nonprofits get their story out, where is that story going to get published? Who's going to be around to publish it? What we found in that 2009 study was that there was a rich, growing online news environment that was being generated by a variety of different kinds of publishers. We also documented that there was actual less local news coverage over the last 20 years. And would these new online sites, be they from legacy media or micro hyperlocal sites, replace what we remember we used to get from the downtown daily newspaper? We also rank sites, somewhat controversially for some, because the research methodology to measure traffic, audience reach, news quality was, shall we say, in its infant stage. We have, in the work that we've done then and since, relied very much on other colleagues, including Michelle McLennan, Jan Schaefer, and others, to build on this body of research, including the work that Northwestern's been doing that you'll hear about later this afternoon. Two of the sites that we mentioned in our online site prominently are no longer around. And indeed, a site that came into being around 2010, which was our second study where we looked at the needs of operators and discovered that there was an even richer online news environment building, but that by and large, beyond legacy downtown media sites, we were looking at a lot of kitchen table labors of love that were cookie jar financed. We think that's probably still the case. Our study this year is not looking at operations or financial models or anything like that. That's a different conference for another day, including the block by block conference the next 2 days here at Loyola. So we come to the present, and what we wanted to look at with this year's study was what's changed. Who's producing the best news? Who's attracting the most eyes? And I think it's important, particularly for out-of-town visitors, to know that unlike some other locales, our best example of a brand new from scratch online news site has come and gone since we last looked at this environment. The Chicago News Cooperative, which was a much noted locally and nationally site that had a connection with the New York Times and some significant funding, didn't make it. And rich journalism for about a year and a half. I'd be happy to engage people after this conference about other reasons why they are or not here anymore. But without further ado, I want to get into this year's research because I'm sure you'll have questions after Emily presents it. I want to give a lot of credit to Nora Farrell for keeping us on track, on schedule, and doing massive amounts of copy editing to keep all this stuff straight. And indeed, it was always our hope that more people would see this through the online version, which includes some rich videos and other ways to look at this data beyond the printed report. But yes, we have a gorgeous printed one in front of you. Without further ado, Emily, why don't you run our audience through what we learned?
Okay. Thanks so much, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you, and it's been so nice. We've definitely learned a lot in the past 2 years since we took our last in-depth look at the Chicago news ecosystem. Today we're going to do 3 basic things. First, we're going to tell you what we did. And then the second, we're going to show you a list of the top 5 sites that were ranked in all of the categories we looked at. The entire rankings are available in the booklet that you have, and they're also available online. And then finally, we're going to talk about some of the lessons that we learned from engaging in this research, some of the conclusions that we have about the state of online news as we found it. What we did was in some ways very straightforward. We looked at measures of how much traffic is coming to sites in the Chicago, individual sites in Chicago based on publicly available measures. And then workshop staff and board members rated those sites based on their assessment of news quality and community engagement. In some ways, that does not tell the full story of how, if you are a citizen living in Chicago, how you get your news every day. So interspersed within the report are some interviews, video clips and quotes from interviews that we did with Chicago site publishers, public relations people, other folks who depend upon news as part of their jobs, to talk a little bit about what this changing ecosystem means for them every day as they try to stay informed. And the full text of those clips or the full text in the full video is available on the website. A reminder that for those of you at home to please, and those of you who are here, to please tweet your questions and comments. We have hashtags here. And for those of you who are also watching, if you could keep an eye at the end of the session for questions from our live stream audience so that we can be sure to address them. Before we get started, we just want to say a quick thank you. At every stage of this process, we engaged in a group of advisors. Several of them are here today. It is our thanks to them for the wisdom that we were able to gain from them. Obviously, any oversights are ours and not theirs. But our thanks to this advisory committee, which took time to help us throughout the summer in shaping this research. So before we get started, we want to show a clip from Fernando Diaz, who I believe is here, talking about how the new news ecosystem has really changed his day.
I was a newspaper reporter. So I started as a newspaper reporter, and I would get the paper, and I would wake up at 9, and then I would, read every paper I could get my hands on, and then I'd come in at 10, and then I'd pitch my editor, and that's all dead. Now I wake up, I pick up my phone, I check everything that's breaking, I check everything that I can, I try to understand what our position is with respect to our competition, and then I start to identify what our workflow is. For example, we have access to publish a bunch of information, but consistently now we're looking more toward integrating what's happening on the social web into our news report. So rather than just saying that's happening or that happened, it's how does that metastasize into the news, into what actually is happening.
Thank you, Fernando. And for those who are not local to Chicago, Hoy is our leading Spanish language daily. Just to provide a little bit of context. Okay, so we started this report earlier this year with about 1,000 URLs to look at, and those URLs came from one of 3 sources. The first is from a product that Community Media Workshop publishes every year and has for a very, very long time. Its annual meeting guide, getting into air, online and into print. The second source is our fellow researchers. Rich Gordon's team provided a list of sites that served as the starting point for their link analysis research, and we're very grateful for their cooperation. The third source that we looked at was the findings from our 2010 report, and the sites that came to our attention both during the 2010 report's research and after it was published. This is a very, very dynamic ecosystem, as you can imagine. Sites come and go all the time. Tom mentioned just 3 of them. So it's really, it's a challenge to kind of stay on top of what's coming and going, and so we wanted to use multiple sources to stay on top of that. From those sites, we removed duplicates, as you can imagine. We had a lot. And then we also removed those sites that serve predominantly a suburban or national audience, our goal being to really look in this case at the city of Chicago. That is not to say that the suburbs do not have very, very important and worthwhile things to teach us about what's changing in the new news ecosystem. It's just that for purposes of time, we really had to kind of, focus on a specific area. So there is, in the printed report and online, a sidebar by Curtis Black talking about what's going on in the suburban news system in Chicago, and I recommend it highly. Then we looked at more than 400 sites to see if they met what we considered a minimum standard for news participation. In this definition, we are indebted to Michelle McClellan and her initial Black by Black research. We used a very similar standard. We looked at sites in April 2012 and looked to see if they had published a minimum of 12 news items. And then finally, once we had 191 sites that fit those criteria, and we looked at how they were, what measures we could get to assess how far they were reaching into the Chicago ecosystem, how much were they being read. And in that sense, we looked at 5 categories of data. We looked at the number of RSS readers from Google. We looked at Alexa ranking. We looked at compete.com traffic estimates. We looked at their social media reach, either through Twitter or Facebook. And then we looked at their Alexa rankings. This is an area in which we have really that we really thought hard about, because I think that there is no one perfect way to measure reach, especially for sites that aim only to serve a single neighborhood. But we borrowed a lot of the methodology from our 2009 report, and we'll continue to learn and evolve on this. So once we were there, we had 51 sites that we decided to score, and we scored them in 5 categories. So there's a citywide news category, there's a neighborhood news category, there's a specialty news category if you cover one or more topics, there's an aggregation category, and then there's an arts, culture, and entertainment category that we scored. When we scored, we relied upon workshop staff and board members to look at 2 items. First of all, we wanted to look at news quality, since first and foremost, if you're going to come to a website, you'd like to read well-produced, thoughtful news. We looked at a variety of criteria. We looked at the range of topics being covered. Is this site devoted to kind of a full airing of its topic or issue or region, or is it really only focused on 1 or 2 items? Is there thoroughness to the coverage? And when we talked about thoroughness, it leads into the next item, which is the range of voices and viewpoints covered. The workshop, as we talk about a lot, exists in order to help diverse perspectives and diverse stories to get into the news. And even to this day, although forces probably conspire for this, there's a lot of Me Too coverage that happens. And so we really were looking out for coverage that went out of its way to be thoughtful and to kind of go the extra mile in telling stories. And then we looked at the quality of the writing that we saw. And then finally, we looked at, for sites that do aggregation, whether their aggregation practices were ethical and could be understood. We also, the last category that we looked at when we scored was community engagement. One of the best things about being online, as opposed to being a TV station or a radio station or a newspaper, is that readers can interact with the site in real time, and that can have a real influence on the behavior of the site and on how people experience it. So we looked at some basic measures of transparency. Can you find who publishes the site? Can you contact authors? Are people sharing the content, and is that easy to do? But then we looked at two other categories of things. Can visitors interact with the website, and if so, are the visitors' voices valued and kind of displayed and made important on the website? And then finally, do publishers interact with those visitors, or are publishers using social media purely to kind of push out their own content? As in any study of this type, no one piece of methodology is perfect. Our hope is we have learned from some of the efforts that other folks have done. Our hope is that people will learn from us as well. I would say that measures of reach continue to be a challenge for us, and in particular, we note that measures of reach have probably undercounted ethnic media in this study. Both in the report and online, you will see that there's a separate sidebar where we pull out notable ethnic media sites, but I think that this is something that we are well aware of. The second thing I think we would say is that not everyone, I think, will agree with every categorization we've made. We went through a multiple step process to both choose categories and validate them, but at the same time, a different group of people looking at slightly different data from us might make different decisions. Finally, our methodology looks at news website publishers. So if you operate a website that publishes news, that's what we were looking at. So that means if you were publishing a listserv or you're updating a Facebook page, or you run an e-newsletter and it doesn't track back to a website, we probably didn't score your site. So that's one of those things that we just have to be really upfront about. And finally, our methods favor sites that are built to be freestanding. So the Huffington Posts of the world, where Huffington Post Chicago is a front page, but really all of that content is part of a larger Huffington Post content management system. Those sites don't necessarily do as well in the way in which we gather data as other sites might. It really favors the homegrown freestanding website. And with this, we're going to transition to, it's actually kind of an ironic transition, to Laura Washington, who is a local journalist and political analyst. She might be here today, but I'm not sure if she's actually here. And she spent some time when we were interviewing her talking about how just the way that she consumes news via email is very different than, say, flipping through the sections of a newspaper.
I go down my list. I have maybe 10 or 12 sites that I get email alerts from every day, from national to local, and I try to, plow through all of them every day. Some of them are kind of staggered, so they come at different times of day, which helps a lot. It's just like reading an old-time newspaper. You don't read everything. You pick and choose as you go through the sites, or as you go through the emails, because most of the emails have links to information on their sites. And I find that's a much more efficient way. The email alerts are a much more efficient way to get through those sites than the traditional way of turning a page or going directly to the sites.
Thank you. So I feel like I need a drum roll, but thank you. So anyway, so our first category is Citywide news. For those of you who are local to Chicago, the fact that Chicago Tribune is #1 is perhaps not surprising. Chicago Tribune scored a perfect score on our 5 reach measures. And I think that when our reviewers looked at it, they noted that this is, it's a metro newspaper that manages to kind of do everything. I mean, during our review period, we were looking at the Sikh shooting, and the reviewers were very taken by the fact that, that there's still really high quality in breaking news coverage, and also noted that that the Tribune has been a pioneer in social engagement, even though it, like a lot of major metropolitan newspapers, suffers from kind of this problem with comments not sort of being a well-managed or integrated, always part of its website. I think some of the other interesting things that we note here are, our two-way tie for third with Chicago Magazine and WBEZ. WBEZ is our flagship public radio station here, and the magazine is our monthly magazine. And I think that Chicago Magazine has worked very, very hard to expand its online reach over the past couple of years, which is definitely reflected here. And for those of you who maybe are not familiar with Chicago, the Reader is our alternative weekly, for lack of a better word. So, these are our Metro News rankings. And then next up is specialty news, and specialty news is news that covers a particular topic or really takes a deep dive in one focus area. And our winner in this category is Catalyst Chicago. And for those of you who are not from Chicago, Catalyst specializes in education coverage. And in a week like this week, when the Chicago teachers are on strike and having very, very significant and momentous discussions with the city over what the future of teaching and the teachers' relationship with the schools is going to be like, Catalyst, I think for those of us reading it, Catalyst has proved itself to be indispensable. And the reviewers were very, very taken with the quality and thoughtfulness of their coverage. The other thing that I would like to note here is that 4 and 5 are sites that are focused on transportation, and that the Active Transportation Alliance is not a traditional news publisher. So those are our specialty news rankings. And then we move on to neighborhood news, which is, I have to say, and this is not just sucking up to the block by block people, this is my favorite category. Uptown Update is a blog that started out as a little bit of a powerful one-trick pony to working on a particular alderman, but has expanded to cover a very diverse North Side neighborhood, and where it really focuses on reader voices. When you look at the full rankings here, I think you'll see that there's a lot of diversity here. Moving on to arts, culture, and entertainment, Time Out Chicago, our local magazine, or the local branch of the Time Out chain, was the winner with just hugely comprehensive listings, almost overwhelming, according to our reviewers. And I'd like to also point out we have 2 food sites that made this list, and also New City, which is kind of the flagship of a confederation of arts and culture websites that round out our top 5. Finally, looking at aggregators, this is also a fascinating group of people. Our winning person here, our winning site is Chicagoist, which is the local outpost of the national aggregation chain. And then second on our list is Chicago's branch of Everyblock, which has a completely different method for aggregating information, but has also really bumped up its community engagement over the past couple of years. And our reviewers had very kind things to say about that aggregation. So before we transition into conclusions, I just want to talk about sort of one of the consequences of having, we ranked 51 sites. There were 191 sites that were kind of eligible for ranking. What are you going to do with all of this information? And, Valerie conducted a number of our interviews, but we interviewed her as well. And, her point that I'm dedicated to ferreting out information, and if you're not, you could really miss things, I think is really important. It also, I think, feeds a little bit into our next presentation, if I can spoil that a little bit. But I think it is a really important thing, that the fact that news consumption has changed tremendously over the time in which we've been looking at this study. Finally, we just want to talk about some of the lessons that we learned from conducting this research. The first is, and I think this is especially true for Metro News, more Metro News does not mean more Metro sites does not necessarily mean more Metro News. It feels like there is a single producer making decisions around the front page of a lot of these websites, and so it's really hard. In some places, investigative reporting splits that difference, but there's a lot of like Me Too front pages out there. The second, and this is probably not surprising for the Block by Blockers here, sites really vary in their use of social media and in web-based storytelling. Some site publishers have really gotten this done well. One of the reviewers cited the controversy over Chick-fil-A. Crane's Chicago business used Storify to aggregate the tweets from kind of the days in which there were boycotts. And we felt like that was a very interesting kind of new, not necessarily super new, but gratifying way to see a traditional publisher embrace social media. The third thing that we saw is that reader engagement is really infrequent. It's not necessarily of high quality. The sites that really seem to nurture comments and take user submissions seriously are definitely still of the exception rather than the rule here. The fourth comment we would make is that innovation both in models and in sort of ways in which people are approaching things is mostly happening in neighborhoods. And then finally, we have a shout out for WBEZ, which was not our top rate site in the survey, but we really felt like did a lot of combinations of things well. Uh-oh, what have I done? Here we go. And then this is our pitch for reading the report online. You can see all the videos, you can get more information, and we would just encourage all of you to ask your questions and share feedback with us so that as we continue to do this, we can make it even better. Thank you.
Our Rich's team comes up. We have some time for questions, reactions. We'd love you to give us your question on the microphone so the folks listening online can also hear it. And the first question will come from over here.
Hi, I'm Celeste from Donors Forum. What do you think the implications are for nonprofits that want to get their message out in terms of what you found in your study?
Already have websites. Did figure in Rich's study, and I will leave his results to explain that a little bit more because institutional websites definitely play a role. We're also finding institutional websites that don't necessarily see themselves producing journalism, are producing information that folks are going out to try to find. We are also finding, to steal another page from Rich's report, that keeping your Facebook page updated may be as important or more so today because of the role of social media than what you do with your homepage. And in fact, we know from other studies having nothing to do with our research, more and more people are finding us through side doors, not through our homepage. So social media is increasingly playing a major role in how people find you and get your information.
Hi there. I'd just like to amplify that. I think that if your reach is your goal is specifically neighborhood-based or specialty-based, that I think that the time and attention that you pay towards specialty sites and neighborhood sites is going to be really important. And to add on to Tom's point, it makes it important for nonprofit organizations to be really proficient in telling their story in words, in pictures, and in video, because I think that the time devoted to storytelling amongst all these publishers is really low. I'm not saying this based on this research, just sort of my general sense, but that the opportunity to just kind of share your story through some of these sites has increased.
What was the criteria you used for evaluating the neighborhood blogs? How did you rank 1 through 5?
So the total score is 35 points. 25 of those points came from measures of reach. So the Google RSS readers, the Compete.com scores, Alexa traffic ranks, social media, and I know I'm forgetting one, so I need to go look what it is. So then the last 10 points came from the news criteria. We took a number of factors and scored them and put them together to come up with the 1 to 5 score for news quality. And then we had another 5-point score that we assessed for community engagement. I would say overall the neighborhood sites, just based on both their target audience and also the way that we were measuring this, started out with lower reach scores, which makes sense. They're not trying to reach an entire region, they're reaching a neighborhood. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Good afternoon, Carl West, TBT News Service. Why didn't you guys rank e-newsletters?
E-newsletters, it's not that we did not find e-newsletters to be really valuable. It's that the criteria that we used for ranking news sites were very site-specific. E-newsletters can't be ranked based on a Google Reader score. E-newsletters can't primarily be ranked due to their traffic or due to the quality of their inbound links. And those were 3 of the 5 criteria that we used in order to assess that. That is not to say that e-newsletters don't play a really vital role. One of the reasons that we interviewed Ernie Sanders, who's one of the What I Read people, is that he's incredibly reliant on e-newsletters to get information from his neighborhood. And there are some cases where I believe we have some honorable mentions in the report, and there are Facebook pages and some e-newsletters that are included in there. So it's, it unfortunately relates to kind of how we were measuring reach for audience. And to measure e-newsletters, we would have to probably get subscriber data, which I'm not sure we would have consistently been able to get.
And not to make too fine a point, we know that e-newsletters play an incredibly important role, both in terms of a delivery platform, and I will also say from my own experience, certain underreported communities are getting more information about them and what's going on through e-newsletters, which is why we did honorable mentions and why we also did another sidebar with Ernie Sanders to try to pick up on some of the richness of what's out there. Our study design built on our prior work is very web-centric, and that is something, if we're allowed to continue this research and do another report, that will have to evolve and change, because the ecosystem we're measuring is evolving and changing, and that's probably one of the more significant things that both Rich's group and our group are trying to get a handle on. This is no longer a matter of who has a good website.
Oh, good afternoon. Thank you. Just curious on your observations about news sites, you mentioned underrepresented communities, news sites that were covering primarily African American neighborhoods on the south and west sides of the city.
Yeah, we looked, I think we looked at a number of sites on the south and west side. I think that we also, have to pay a shout out to Austin Talks to say that, they're playing a valuable role. I think what I would tend to say a little bit more broadly is that this has been a really tough time of transition for ethnic media, and in terms of maintaining, the cost that it takes to kind of transition and maintain a good website and to maintain a newsroom, I think affects equally, if not disproportionately, to ethnic media and to traditional media. I'm not necessarily sure if I'm in a position to kind of assess the quality of the coverage of what we saw, just that we recognize that it's an area that was difficult for us to address in the report, and I'm going to turn it over to Tom and see if he has anything else he wants to say.
So Carl's listserv, bronzeville.com, are two incredibly vital sites. There are Latino sites that are similar like that don't have the web presence that would have them showing up forcefully in the kind of research we did in this round. And as Emily already alluded to, traditional community weekly papers haven't always made the transition to the web very robustly. So we're in a transition stage, I think, with the way niche publications that are now trying to use the web and social media and listservs to get information out in a different way, as well as to a different generation, is still evolving. And measuring what we all do with this device is going to be the challenge of future researchers, because really it's not a laptop or what kind of tower you have anymore. It's how we're accessing the information we need through this device. And we still need to find those appropriate research tools to capture all that activity.
And I just want to add, one of the reasons we know that ethnic media is challenged, and this gets to some of the smaller sites in predominantly Latino or African American neighborhoods, we've been doing an ethnic media project at the workshop for a couple of years now, and we know one of the biggest challenges facing these sites is they had budgets that were making it hard to operate a print publication under, and then they're challenged to move this to the website as well. And the finances of that just don't work. So that's one of the things that we've been working on through our ethnic media project, is to try to help them figure out ways to do this, to make this transition successfully. Unfortunately, one of the results, as Emily and Tom has said, is that the reach numbers are just not there for those sites yet. But that's why we wanted to write about that separately and talk about, we do feel like that's a place that is missed in this report because of the way the methodology is set up.
Tom, if I may make a comment on that. One of the reasons that the workshop divided it into categories was to try to get more visibility, particularly for neighborhood sites, because if you'd put them all in one pot, all of the bigger sites would have risen to the top and you wouldn't have seen any of the medium to smaller sites. And so what they tried to do was to divide it up into categories so you would see more breadth of sites in a variety of different ways. And then they added the honorable mentions, and then they added the news profiles to try to get a sense of the complexity of the whole thing, even though the numbers weren't high enough in some areas.
I have a Twitter question from Kelly Gilfillan. Is there a correlation between good use of social media and high readership?
I think that there's definitely a correlation between good social media usage, and yeah, I think that on a citywide level, there probably is a correlation between good social media usage and relationship. I'm concerned about using the word correlation because I don't have my statistics hat on right now. I would say that on the community level, there's probably a correlation between certain types of social media usage and certain types of reader engagement. If you're using social media to kind of push out your stories, you might get more readership, but you're not necessarily getting higher quality community engagement. So I think that's probably as far as I'm going to go with that, if that's okay.
Did you attempt to measure impact at all, either on public affairs, public issues, legislation? whatever.
We would traditionally call that perhaps content analysis, and no, as much as we wanted to go there, there was not budget or time to look at that. It is something I am immensely curious about. It is also something the Northwestern team is immensely about, because the nature of both these studies is how are citizens going to get the information they need to make good decisions. If the public square that the daily paper maybe used to represent is disappeared or changed, and we have access issues to whatever that new place is that we get information, then measuring impact from wherever journalism or data or information sharing is going on, I think is going to be real important. But it was not what we were looking at with this particular research. A really, really important question and a totally different piece of research.
Hi everyone, Ernie Sanders. Tom, is a great point. I was going to ask if at all this research lends itself to any platform for advocacy, civil, decision making, community economic development opportunities going forward.
Yes. That would be a good conference, Ernie. Ernie is one of our sidebars and also, in full disclosure, a former board member of the Community Media Workshop, and was involved with one particular experiment that's been going on in Chicago, which are portals that list the Local Initiative Support Corporation has worked on for some time, in part to bring a richer tableau of stories from underreported communities, but also to really make sure this new information technology is being practically applied in communities that may have otherwise been overlooked. So I think the economic development potential is huge. And indeed, the first year we did this research, I remember Charles Benton, who some of you might know, his keen interest was, how can these portals and these websites and all this other stuff we have this richness with help people find jobs, find the local store, find the places that would help local economic activity really blossom in communities that are otherwise maybe looked over or not seen in that light. So that has nothing to do particularly with our research, but I would hope people could take our research and what Northwestern has done and draw some conclusions there.
Hello, my name is Luis Magana. I work with the Resurrection Project and actually wanted to comment on what you just said. Myself and Elizabeth Rosatlandas, we work with the Resurrection Project, and we actually manage the Pilsen Portal. And actually, we're excited because we just saw that the portal is, we got a mention in the, we're number 6 in the community neighborhood portals. So I recommend that you guys check us out, pilsenportal.org. What we've been trying to do with the Pilsen Portal is we want to highlight the positive stories that take place in Pilsen. There are people who have this idea of what Pilsen is. It's a beautiful, vibrant, dynamic community, and we're trying to showcase that with our website. What we've realized is that a lot of the mainstream press doesn't really focus on the positivity that takes place in our community. The other thing that we're trying to do to talk about economic development is we create original content. One of the things that we do is we actually produce and film videos, and we work closely with the Chamber of Commerce, Greater Pilsen Economic Development Association, to do video profiles on the businesses. Why? Because we want people from outside of the community to come and visit Pilsen. It is a beautiful community, but it's a lot of work that we have to put into it. But we do see that these portals are very, very important to our communities. So
thank you for making that point. I just wanted to add, we all love the neighborhood news category. We think, that was our favorite to see what was ranked. We're really proud to see, various sites from around the city there. And I think this ties into the earlier question about how do nonprofits get their news out in this sort of changing ecosystem. As somebody who's done public relations for a long time, it provides us with more opportunities. I lived in Edgewater for a long time. Edgeville Buzz is my site. So if the Chicago Tribune does a story about Edgewater, that's great. I know a lot of people see it. But who do I really trust? I trust the Edgeville Buzz because I know that's where I go to get my neighborhood news all the time. So in some ways, as a communications person is thinking about, the people who live there, who did they trust to get their news from? And it really has changed, and places like the Pilsen Portal are providing a service and filling a gap that I think existed in some of these neighborhoods before. So it's just a really interesting category, and as Emily said, we're seeing so much innovation at that level that I think is really exciting.
Another question over here. Yes. Okay, once you've accumulated all this data, which you have done, which is great, now what's next? And there's a recommendation that I may have that maybe you can create a source like an AP report on Bloomberg News where everybody who has a site, our portal, can actually go in and share content where we can put each other's content on sites if we see it's valuable, even though it's about another community. We may want to share that information throughout the gamut of the sites.
Yes.
Hi, Tracy from Windy City Times. You mentioned that it was difficult to categorize places. So, for example, we could be in specialty media. We could be in, I don't know, a broad term of ethnic media.
There's a whole subcommittee meeting over.
And for gay media in Chicago, there's not a lot of choices out there, but it is a subcategory that would seem to be difficult to compare to the Chicago Tribune. So I'm just curious what that debate was.
Well, your enterprise could have been in Metro News. It could have been in arts. It could have been in specialty. It could have been in neighborhood. Was probably one of the more difficult sites, to be a little transparent here, to figure out, given the purpose of the study and in fairness to the phenomenal work that you do, where does this best fit? So, we could probably have a couple of drinks over where it would best be. And I'm comfortable with where you ended up, but I'm more than willing to talk about where else you might have been.
I just like to talk generally about how we treated ethnic media and specialty audience media, because this issue is not just with your site, but with, we looked at sites that cater to particular religious audiences as well. And generally what we looked at was the surface area of the city that they covered and the broadness or narrowness of their topics. And so generally we didn't, because we were reluctant to kind of create this like ethnic media cage match where all the ethnic media had to fight it out with each other. So there's definitely ethnic media that is or ethnic or special audience media, I should say, that's in Citywide, but there were also probably others that could have been in specialty or in neighborhood, which was why we wanted to kind of treat them in a particular, the ethnic media in particular, in a sidebar, so that some of the smaller but more noteworthy sites did not get lost.
You have about 1 minute for another question.
One more question.
Back here.
Yeah, hi, Zach BDC ClickFix. Do you think over time, comparing this data, perhaps requiring a subsequent year or a previous year, would you consider looking to compare the growth of aggregators, looking at the aggregator data, and using that to maybe compare the aggregator category to, the local news category, to try to determine whether some of these national aggregators are indeed squeezing out the more independent websites that, theoretically may have a tougher time competing with, let's say, a patch.com or an EveryBlock?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I don't want to steal any more thunder from Rich's report, but their networking study will speak to this a little bit. I don't have an opinion. I have a sense about certain things, but it may not be quite what you think, because I'm going to wait and let Rich present his report, and then let's return to that question, because I think it's a very excellent question. That also relates to this. It's somewhat similar, though not the same as content analysis, about impact. Because I would argue the closer to the source, the potentially greater impact the reporting and the site that gets that report out may be. And certainly most of us probably look for that authenticity factor, even if we never used that word before. There is, I remember vividly from our first report, people loved the fact that there were so many other places to go to get information, but we're missing the vetting that they used to get from the daily newspaper that came on the front porch. And that speaks also, I think, a bit to your point. An aggregator may be vetting on a certain level, and that was something we tried to measure, but I do think there's a real important issue here about the original reporter, if you will, the original observer that's putting that content out there. That would be a really, really intriguing thing to look at.
I'd just like to add to that some of the categorization. It would be interesting to see if it continues to be this way in a couple of years, because we looked at, one of the things we looked at is, but ultimately like kind of didn't score on in the same way, was aggregation happening in sites that don't predominantly aggregate. I think there's a strong philosophical argument, which I won't even attempt to try to solve in this meeting or this conversation, about what the role of aggregation is for all news sites, not just sites that like Every Block or Huffington Post. So I do think that it's one of the things that we might see is changes in local versus national operators for aggregation. But the other thing that we might see in a couple of years is a definition of sites where we don't draw that bright line the same way in a couple of years.
Thank you all. Let's get Rich and his team up here.